All right, everybody, we're live. I believe we're live. I've just pressed the button. I think we're on. So welcome, everybody, to Brainfood Live on Air, bringing it to you every Friday. And this is yet another exciting conversation, a necessary conversation to have, because I think we've all kind of seen the effects of this phenomena expressed in our real struggles to find candidates. Where are the missing workers? That is the topic of the conversation today. And I wanted to kind of elevate the chat and get it to a kind of labor economics level. Because we know as recruiters, we know what the situation is on the operational side. We speak to candidates every day. We try to find them. We know the struggle. But what is actually driving that candidate behavior at a higher level? So we've got an amazing guest lineup for you today. I assure you, these people should actually be on TV or something, but somehow they're on Brainfood Live. What can I tell you? Okay, let's do some sound checks first of all. I want to make sure everyone can hear me okay. I've actually had to rejig my setup because I broke my microphone, which is like a real disappointing thing for me to do. So it's actually quite important. It's a serious question. Can you hear me okay? If you're in Crowdcast right now, can you just indicate whether the audio is sounding as it should, i.e. you can hear me, it's not just me miming to camera. Let me know in the comments below there. We are also live streaming this on LinkedIn, so a couple of you, maybe 50 or so, usually 50, 60 people, I think, watch this on LinkedIn Live. If you can see me on LinkedIn and you can hear me there, can you indicate by some sort of emoji whether the audio is okay there as well? Okay, loads of people saying yes, that's fine. And we're piling this out onto Facebook and Twitter as well. Somehow 50 people watch this on Twitter. I don't know who you are, but thank you very much for doing that. Okay, people look like they're hearing it okay. Okay, let's firstly thank our sponsors. We always have to do this after every show. I'm actually amazed that every episode is continually sponsored. The demand is really high, and it's, I think, testament to how great our community is that vendors want to support a conversational show like this. So I just want to give a quick shout out to one of the nicest companies around, and I think one of the best products around. It is iCIMS. More than just an ATS. I found this out actually in the iCIMS Inspire event that I attended last week in the Gherkin, but they've got all sorts of really interesting things there. About, candidate ID, recruitment market automation. They've got an internal marketplace in there as well. They've got all kinds of new innovations that are occurring within their platform. Really exciting thing to look at and to observe. iCIMS, I don't know where they're at in terms of their market positioning, but I do believe they're probably one of the top 2 or 3 with regards to the kind of up and coming sort of products out there. We know the dominance of the likes of Workday, SAP, and so on. But do check out iCIMS if you are on the market looking for an upgrade on your ATS. And by the way, I spoke to Scott McRae, who was the co-founder of Candidate ID, who of course were acquired by iCIMS 6 months or so ago, I think. And I asked him, look, is it possible to buy Candidate ID as a standalone? He said, yeah, absolutely. So it may well be that it's one of those things where you don't want to buy the entire thing straight away, but there's other bits that you like, and you can potentially still, get hold of that functionality without necessarily swallowing the whole piece. So anyway, do check them out. Make sure you have them on your list when you're thinking about an ATS upgrade. Okay, we've got, obviously, hopefully everyone's used to this change of scene. We're going to bring our guests straight on, get into the conversation. So let's make sure we do that. I'm going to invite a few of our folks on. I can see them already. Let me just see if I can get Anita on. There she is. And also we have Pawel, I believe. Let's see whether he's around. He is. There we go. We have Sarah Ali as well. I hope it's not too early for Sarah. Hopefully these folks can come on. By the way, for the guests who've just I've just kind of mentioned, there should be a pop-up. You can see that. Hi, Anita. Hi, Pawel. Hi, Anita, you know what? I think there's a possibility that I can hear my own voice through your computer. Is there something you can do about that? Maybe some headphones would be useful, or if you have some other means to, yeah, that's perfect. Put those in, that should work. Okay, cool. Let's do some intros first. Let's go with you, Pawel. Pawel, can you quickly introduce yourself? Who are you? What it is you do?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Pawel, and I'm an economist at Indeed. I'm based in the UK, and I manage our hiring lab team in Europe and Asia. And we are all economists who do labor market research.
Fantastic. And by the way, the Hiring Labs blog on Indeed is absolutely a must read. I don't think you do a great job of marketing it, Pavel, I have to say, because I don't think enough people know about it. But I think it's
You're
really,
doing a great job.
People should read it. It's really, really good, and it's accessible as well. It's one of those things where, when people think about labor market economics, it might be a little feel as if it's beyond the operational recruiter, but actually it's really accessible, really readable, and really important that you keep doing it. So support that blog piece. Really good. We have Sarah Ali as well. Dr. Sarah Ali, can you quickly introduce yourself? Who are you? What it is you do?
Hi, Hung. Nice to see you again. Dr. Sarah Ali here, based in Olympia, Washington. So it is 6:00 in the morning here. So I'm here to join all of you with my coffee and espresso. But yeah, Radancy, actually HR tech firm, doing a lot of interesting stuff with Fortune 500 clients on recruiting and retention. Nice to meet you all.
Great. And by the way, just without sort of, in order to fair distribution of praise, but the Radancy blog is also really, really good, particularly with your work, Sarah. Actually, I was always interested in, like, you used to post some stuff out there, and I forget who it was that kept pinging it over to me. That was good, but the focus that you do now with the labor side, I think is again vital reading. So make sure share the link down there, Sarah. Worth people checking these out. This is where I get a lot of my information from, folks. So if you want to go direct to source, that's how you do it. Okay, we have Anita Lettink as well. Anita, great to see you. I think it's the first time we met, actually. So if that is the case, it's my pleasure. Welcome to the show. Can you introduce yourself real quick? Who are you? What it is you do?
Hi, I'm calling in from the Netherlands. I'm a future work speaker and an HR tech analyzer or advisor, and I work globally.
And great to have you on the show. Anita, I hate to be a pain in the ass, but the audio on your side is really loud. Is it possible to just turn the volume down just a touch? And then hopefully we can just calibrate that and make sure it doesn't sound too loud. Yeah, it's annoying. I mean, sometimes the AV is like, it's difficult when you're doing a broadcast where there's multiple people on air, because the mic will pick up sort of things coming through the laptop. So hopefully we can find a way to fix that. Okay, have a fiddle with that, Anita, and we're going to get on with the general topic. Okay, so the first things first, let's just set the scene. And I want to be corrected by our panelists here. So, because our panelists, basically, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm basically one of these people that is simply an amateur. But I'm interested and I'm observing this. So I think we first encountered this labor market paradox in more or less 2020, at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, where we had like multiple millions of people being made redundant in the pandemic lockdowns. And everyone just assumed this labor would be available to come straight back into the market when we were ready to recruit again. Didn't happen. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. Why were these people not there? And then, we just struggled through the next year or so trying to find these people. No one had any good idea, with loads of conflicting information. End of 2021, beginning of 2020, 22, we were charging again. It was like a real sense of optimism. The swinging 20s were going to repeat themselves. It was going to be one of those amazing decades where everyone's just going to go for it. After 2.5 years of lockdown, post-vaccine, we're all going to be growing like crazy again. But again, couldn't find a candidate. It's not there. So is that general description correct? I want to talk about the theory as to why this is and what we're going to do about it later. But is that what you're seeing from the data? What do you guys think? Go to you first there, Pawel.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's an accurate description. I think there is some nuance depending on which country we're talking about. Certainly the US and the UK are quite different, and continental Europe is a little different as well. But we've seen employers and recruiters pile into the markets very suddenly, and that has led to really some major bottlenecks on the hiring front.
Yeah, very interesting. How about you, Sarah? What's the general view US side?
Yeah, same thing in the US, I would say, as well as Europe. We have now a higher civilian labor force, but nothing obviously is back to the pre-pandemic levels, right? What we saw. And people are still obviously experiencing so many challenges with hiring, recruiting, retention, and so forth. So yeah, super similar.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so folks, this is part of the reason why we can't recruit, right? I mean, if you're struggling to hire people, this is part of the reason. It's actually really important because I think that sometimes the business is relying on recruiters to inform them as to where the candidates are, and we have to educate the hiring managers that actually know it's not because we're incompetent or not because this, that, and the other. There is this global phenomenon, it seems, that nobody can do the hiring. Even like big countries that have huge population, I think India is really struggling to hire. We have Indian people watching this right now. I think Zahir's in. Zahir, let me know, is that the case in India? Suddenly a candidate shortage, which in India had previously never had this. They always had different issues, had assessment issues, they had people showing up on time and all this type of different types of problems. But India seems to be, oh, here's suddenly a new issue. Anita, I'm still picking up keystrokes from you. So I don't know what that is, but I wonder whether we can do something. Maybe if we log back in, close down different browsers and what have you, and then come back. And then let me know when you're back in chat and I'll invite you back in. Might be one way to try and do it. Yeah. I know, it's a struggle. It's a real struggle, but try and like log in and we'll see what we can do. Yeah, really annoying. I want to get Anita onto this, but yeah, sometimes difficult to figure out what's going on. Right. So if we look on the poll, folks, check this out. Down on the bottom, you can see the poll. What is your number one theory as to the cause of this labor market paradox? And it looks like it's a number of different things. This is. It might just be me. I wonder whether that's the case. Thanks, Richard. We're going to bring Anita back on ASAP. I just want to make sure everyone's audio is basically okay, because it can be tough when things are difficult. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, we'll go back to this at some point, but it looks like elevated job seeker expectations is one element. Work-life rebalancing, which I guess is similar, is another. In terms of sort of your analysis, have you been pressured by Indeed or anyone in Indeed, Pawel, to come up with a narrative, like to describe what is going on?
Yeah, certainly there's a lot of interest in the narrative and describing what's going on. And I think what's making this more complicated is that in many ways, in many countries, we haven't quite recovered from the pandemic and reached a new normal in the labor market. And we are already entering a new phase, with very high inflation, with recession risks rising, especially in Europe, but also to some extent in the US. So it's kind of like the issues are getting layered one on top of another. And I think one of the things that we are seeing really across the world right now, at least across the developed world, is that the economy is slowing. The labor market has certainly reached a turning point. So we're no longer seeing, the huge growth in job openings, job vacancies that we saw over the past year. But at the same time, the hiring challenges still persist. There's still a very high number of postings on Indeed, high number of job openings in the official stats, and unemployment and the availability of workers to enter the labor force is still quite low. So we're kind of at this crucial phase, I think, where recruiters are still finding it challenging to find candidates for a lot of jobs, but yet the outlook is really changing, and there's a lot of uncertainty about how things will look like, 6 or 9 months from now.
I just remembered I need to bring Tony Wilson on to the show as well. I knew I was missing somebody, but hopefully he can pop up in a minute and also give us his input. Very interesting to hear that job posting volume has kind of gone down. Is that so? I assume that's going to help somewhat, isn't it? Because an element of not being able to find candidates might be competition from other people. So, if there's 1,000 job postings, there's 100 candidates, you can imagine it actually being much tougher than if there's 500 job postings and there's 100 candidates. Can you give us some numbers, Pawel, on what you're seeing at Indeed in terms of job posting volume? When you're saying that's the case, can you describe what that is for us?
Sure. So what we're seeing is that in the UK and in most of the major European economies, there's been a steady, gradual slowdown of just a few percentage points in terms of job postings falling off from their peaks, which were reached earlier this year. So that's something that kind of is happening steadily. We're still seeing in most countries like the UK, Germany, and France that job volumes are about 40% higher than they were before the pandemic on a seasonally adjusted basis. But that gradual slide is happening. And we're seeing a similar thing in the official statistics on job vacancies. The US is also seeing that trend to some extent, though in the latest JOLTS job openings data, job openings actually ticked up again in July. So it may be that easing of hiring conditions is still to come in the US to a slightly greater extent than in Europe. And we're also hearing anecdotally from a lot of clients, for example, in the retail sector, in the transportation sector, that it has become marginally easier to find candidates. But at the same time, we're still seeing, very low unemployment. The workforce isn't really growing very much. So those challenges are still persisting to a large extent.
Very interesting. And even though there may be a slowdown of job postings, you're saying it's still at a higher than pre-pandemic. So we can't be walking around just relying on competition to go away for us to be able to hire. Jacob, you may actually mention a really interesting point. I think that's also true. Job posting volume itself is a decent measure, but it may not be 100%. Nothing's 100%. But there are companies that simply stop doing it because it's like, okay, it's a waste of time. We're not getting anybody here. We need to apply our budget and our resources elsewhere and do it that way. Folks, I want to just introduce Tony Wilson. Tony Wilson's Director of Institute of Employment Studies. I believe, Tony, great to see you on the show. Thanks for joining us. Can you kind of give us a little bit of commentary on what you're seeing from as a narrative? Like, what is an explanation, do you feel, is a strong explanation as to why this labor market paradox has been persistent over the past 2 years or so?
Well, thanks for having me on. Look, I really agree with a number of the points that have already been made. In the UK in particular, what we're seeing is really significant numbers of people leaving the labour force and not coming back. In many other countries, people are coming back, they're coming back to work, but we've got this, these challenges, these frictions in the labour market because so many people are moving jobs. In the UK, we've got fewer people in the labour force and more people moving jobs, and the nature of work changing, and that's kind of a bit of a perfect kind of storm for us here. Why are there fewer people in the labour force? There's sort of three principal reasons. One is a lot of older people in the UK have left work, and I think many of them have left work permanently. So we've seen a really significant growth in economic inactivity. A horrible phrase, but it means anyone who's not in work, but also not looking for work or not available for work. So they're not unemployed, they're not looking, they're not available. Now, we've seen a growth in terms of over 50s, about 700,000 more people economically inactive. For people under 50, the numbers are broadly flat. So that's problem number one.
That's premature retirement. Like they've checked out, right? They've stopped.
No,
working.
Interestingly, people aged in their 50s, it's about a quarter say they've retired. The other reasons people have left is I didn't feel valued in my job. My job was too stressful. I've got a health condition. I was laid off during COVID and I'm not going back. It's not flexible enough. There's lots of reasons, but there's good data on this. About a quarter are retired. That's the most common reason people have left, but 3/4 have left for any one of these other reasons. And actually 3/4 who have left would come back. And the things that would bring them back would be a job that I enjoy, a job that matches my skills, good social company at work, more money, obviously, greater flexibility. Roughly in order, flexibility came out on top, then pay, then social company, jobs that I enjoy. So we're not doing enough to think about how we attract older people back into the labour force. And a lot of these people aren't looking for work right now. They're relying on savings and pensions. Most say that those pensions and savings won't last them long enough. They won't be able to retire on them. But it's many want to work. And so how we think differently about how we can engage people and bring them back is really important. So that's problem number one. Really super briefly, this on the other two, and I'll come back and I'm really happy to talk about those as well. Really rising long-term ill health across ages is a major challenge. That's probably not long COVID, but it's, among other things, it's the kind of collapse of our health services, the difficulties people are having in accessing healthcare. And the third reason is Brexit. It's lower migration. And migration has driven a growing labour force in the UK since 2006. Labour force has grown by an average 250,000 every year. And most of that has been because of higher employment of non-UK born workers. Since the referendum, that growth has slowed by nearly 100,000 a year. So there's 500,000 gap right there over those 6 years. So these three factors combined are causing, are driving these shortages in workers.
That's really interesting. And Brexit, obviously a UK specific scenario, but I would imagine immigration generally have been hammered over the last couple of years through things like lockdowns and pandemic issues and even traveling into different countries. Only this year, I think, that we were able to actually go to different countries without going through a quarantine process or without going through, some high risk scenario, which might stop you from even going anywhere. So I can imagine there's been a general slowdown of the flow of workers. Which is very interesting. Now, I'm interested in this older workers scenario because I'm kind of heading right in there. I'm kind of into that category. Would it be fair to say that there's a period of time where we made a lot of people redundant? I think 100+ million people were made redundant during the pandemic. I forget what the number was, but an extraordinarily large number of people were made redundant. Would it be fair to say that a lot of those people had a feeling, said, okay, great, you've made me redundant at a critical time. I don't owe you too much. I'll come back on my terms. And they've come back basically a lot more bullish and a little bit kind of offended by how they were treated on the first wave of pandemic. Any thoughts on this? Anita, I'll bring you on this. What's your kind of observation on that phenomena particularly?
Yeah, I would be really careful with that statement, simply because in many geographies around the world, the number of people in jobs is now higher than it was before the pandemic. So that contradicts that statement. People are willing to come back. And you see that especially in economies that during the pandemic entered into programs with employers to keep people in jobs. So in fact, they subsidized employers to hold on to their workers instead of firing these workers. I think the major issues that are behind all these worker shortages are numbers. It's demographics. I do a lot of work with population pyramids. And when I show these to people, that always makes it so clear. So the number one thing that I would recommend to anyone listening to this conversation, find the population numbers for your country, and then just look at the difference between the 55 and 65-year-olds and, let's say, the 20 to 30-year-olds. And for all of the Western economies, what you will find is there are less people getting into the workforce than getting out, which means we simply have less bodies. And like Tony said, a lot of the immigration that naturally provided us with more people during the pandemic, that completely stopped. And those people went back to their countries and found jobs there. And I want to point out something else that is on the one hand sad, but on the other hand also helpful. If you look at countries near Ukraine, you can see that their labor shortage has somewhat diminished. I just looked at the numbers this week because I was doing some work for Europe. And what you see, for instance, in Poland and Romania is that the number of people in job has gone up and the number of job openings has gone down. And that is a consequence of Ukrainian people moving across the border, fleeing the war. And so that shows that immigration plays a big part in many countries in filling jobs. And because we have not had that for 2 to 3 years, that so influences our local labor markets.
Okay, thank you for introducing that point, Anita, and that kind of aligns. I think Jacob's very keen to talk about this, and we do need to talk about it in recruiting. As an industry, we kind of, I can't remember us talking about population statistics or worker population, or even things like, labor force replacement type of terminology, but we do need to talk about it because we cannot rely on immigration. Brexit is one example. That's kind of, in the UK politically, we've made a decision. COVID is another thing that's been a massive friction to people moving around also. But we've got away really from, in some ways you could see it as exploiting poorer parts of the world, bringing workers in to solve a problem which is fundamentally about not enough people that are able to work, or we've got too old as a society, and we don't have enough taxpayers, we don't have enough workers to support the infrastructure that we've put in. And it seems to be a universal phenomenon. I think if you look at any country that has gone through the development path, they all have the same thing. They end up sort of reducing the numbers of kids they have, and that ultimately over time, over a couple of generations, get themselves in a situation where they need immigration to fuel society. These are bigger problems than we can solve today, but that's something that I think COVID, Brexit, and the recent kind of dissembling of the international system, if you like, has kind of shown us that we have these issues. Okay, very, very interesting. Jacob, thanks for sharing the data there. Please do keep piling that through. It is interesting to talk about the neighboring countries that have absorbed the large volume of refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine. And we're talking millions of people here. So this is not a small number of people. And we're also talking about working age people. Generally speaking, a lot of young people have left. And there is an economic outcome to this, and very interesting, Anita, that you mentioned that we've seen more workers employed and less job postings as a result of it. It should make a difference if you have 3 million extra people that you didn't before. So I guess that tells us a lot in terms of how we need to rethink maybe how we treat asylum seekers, refugees, and so forth. Right now, UK certainly has a very hostile policy. The still prevailing attitude is not only keep them out, but as soon as if they do come in, it's like prevent them from working. Because they're not provided with interaction with the state, so they can't actually contribute, and then we blame them for not working, and then it kind of feeds into that narrative. So maybe we need to really reset all of this. Okay, let's deal with that big question. It's such an overwhelming question. We want to deal with it at the end of the conversation. Otherwise, it might just overwhelm everything we're talking about here. Let's deal with some of the other theories as to why this was. Tony, I think you set it out for us really well. Let's have the panel all contribute to some of the points that you made. So let's talk about the older people firstly. Is there a case, like what kind of work does anyone know? Like, well, how do we get that generation back? And I'm hesitant to use the language, and I'm kind of heading that direction myself. It's not going to be a couple of years before I get there. But let's say you're 50, 55, 60, so on like that. What are your demands for an employer? Any thoughts on this? And by the way, folks, if anybody watching this is of that age range, please do comment. Let us know what you're thinking about when you're looking at job opportunities. We need to just get that out from behind the scenes and talk about it a bit more. Thoughts? Let's throw this open to everyone.
Look, I'm happy just to jump in. Firstly, I really agree with Anita's points about demographic change. And so this kind of then means that I think policymakers, recruiters, employers need to think more about how we encourage people to work longer in general, support people to work longer, but also think about how we can help people to work more flexibly. Yes, it's really important, in particular if people have got care and responsibilities, whether that's children or elder care or whatever. So how we can raise participation in labour force is really important. On older workers, I think a lot of the evidence and the research suggests, I think we all have a sort of stereotype in our heads about older people in employment. I mean, actually, that's I'm 5 years off being in that group too, I think, and actually a lot of the research shows really clearly that now that older people work in the same sorts of jobs as younger people, are motivated and have similar values to young people, but a really important difference is they may not have looked for work in the recent past. So how we help people to recognise the value of their own skills, to understand what sorts of jobs may be available, the transferability of skills that they've got, think differently about the jobs that are available is really important. And then some of those factors motivate people, maybe slightly different, but nonetheless fairly similar. Points around kind of flexibility at work is clearly really important, as is as is around trying to find things that give that enable people to use the skills that they've got and to sort of develop those and grow those. And improving security at work matters too. But there's a ton of different factors there, I think. But I suppose my general point, I don't think actually it's that necessarily that different to how we support other people, how we try to support other people who are out of work to come back in, or people who may be looking to change jobs. No,
but Tony, you did mention something really important, which is actually something that recruiters can action. Like, we can deal with this. One of those. This is not a conversation where these topics kind of fly over our heads. We can actually deal with this, because it could well be that an older worker may not have been on the market as frequently. Perhaps they found themselves inadvertently on the market a couple of years or so ago. Their last experience of looking for work then might have been in the late 90s, or not the late 90s, but the 2015, 16, that kind of level. We're already like 8 years past that. So the world has changed in terms of job search, how people behave has changed, what people expectations behave. Maybe what recruiters should be doing is coaching or just identifying, okay, here's how basically the most optimal way to look for work is this. These are the new things that you need to get involved with. Even basic stuff. I mean, I'm again using broad brushes, so forgive me on this. But there's a possible perception. Probably, I'm prepared to actually suggest this may be the case, but perhaps an older person that's in the 50s, 60s, and so on may have less fluency with things like video, for instance. They may have less sort of quality in terms of the technology. You know how young people tend to be very much updating everything, have to have the best things all the time. As you get older, maybe those things become less important for the job search. Perhaps that's really significant. So there's things that we recruiters can do. I'd be interested to know from the crowd actually whether anybody is doing anything. Are we targeting over 55 specifically? Does anybody have a diversity program that kind of thinks about ageism and so on? I'd love to hear from you if you do, because maybe that's a show topic that we can run in future as well. Okay, cool. Let's talk about the second point that was mentioned, which I think again is under discussed. Long-term illness. Not only COVID and long COVID, but also because COVID-19 stressed the health systems so much globally that basically lots of people that had issues now have bigger issues because they weren't seen or treated. And some of those things have become debilitating. And by the way, as a person who's recently had COVID, and I think fully recovered, but it did knock me out for like 5 days. Like legit, I could not operate. And you just wonder when you hear stories about people that have these persistent symptoms, like I can totally understand why they may not actually be able to do any work, because it is that way. Mind fog, you can't, you don't have control of your body, it seems. Your motivation is on the floor, energy is on the floor. I totally get it. If you look at the numbers, particularly in the US, by the way, I think, I forget how many people were infected by COVID in the US. I think it's a very high number. But I read somewhere, Sarah, I wonder that you confirm, but something like 500,000 people maybe suffering from long-term disability directly as a result of COVID.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wanted to chime in here actually. So yeah, obviously in the US, we've been hit by COVID, obviously. But I was looking at a Brookings Institute study. This was 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. About 4 million Americans are no longer in the labor force because of long-term COVID. There was a paper released, I believe, by Stanford and MIT about a week and a half ago in the Wall Street Journal, citing that 500,000 Americans are no longer in the workforce due to COVID. And I think from my recent blog post, Hung, thank you for sharing that. There was a survey conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau. It's called the Household Pulse Survey. They asked 100 million American questions, right, about, the economy and so forth. And I think after retirements, the number 2 reason for not being in the labor force was because of long-term COVID issues. And the other issues were caregiving, right? So the long-term COVID and the caregiving are kind of related together. And so those are kind of the barriers we're seeing. And, one point I'll make, I know Anita talked about numbers. I wanted to add to that, it's fertility rate, right? It's immigration rate, it's mortality rate, all of these different variables, right? They impact the labor force. But Radancy, we actually ask candidates questions about what are the factors that they prioritize when they're applying for jobs. And it's interesting, year over year, what I found, at least from our data, is that work having a greater purpose, interesting and challenging work, and then, good people to work with, that to me, those were the three factors that were more important than things like compensation or location. So, I think right now it's still a job seekers market in the United States, maybe a little bit so in the UK as well, but just kind of interesting that people are still thinking about those factors. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
No, really interesting point. Two separate points there, but let's deal with the first one. I mean, those numbers are really astonishing. 500,000 is a big number. And that's not including the people that have primary caregiving responsibilities, of course. So going back to your initial observation, Tony, where there was a number of people that were economically inactive, so to speak, but they weren't prematurely retired. Like, how many of those are actually because they've got an obligation? They have to look after somebody at home. I mean, I've had that situation back in the past when, my mom was in really bad shape. Obviously, she's okay now, but I had to take six months off. Like, I couldn't do it. I couldn't work. I had to take that time away. So that is a very significant factor. I guess having a flexible job is going to help in some way. Back in the day, going into the office, that's a no-go. If you have to have 24/7, at least observational, you have to be there. But if you're in a case where you could deliver some work remotely, that can help. And maybe we get to the kind of idea of doing things fractionally as well, fractional work. So maybe you're no longer working 40 hours, 50 hours for one employer, but you could do 5 hours here or 10 hours there, because probably even primary caregivers might have that kind of time if they're able to flex it across, the week. I don't know whether the panelists have ever been in that situation. I mean, have you ever sort of had to devote primary time to caring for somebody? And what does it look like in order to do a job for an employer? Could you do those two things simultaneously, or how would that work? I don't know whether anybody's a parent here or anybody's had that sort of experience.
I can speak to that really quickly. So during the pandemic, my father actually had a massive heart attack. And so, I had to leave the state of California, go back to the state of Missouri. I opened up an LLC. So that's kind of how I was side hustling. I actually left a full-time job and just got a little entrepreneurial. And so, things got back to normal. Then I kind of just re-entered the labor force as a full-time employee. But yeah, that's what I was dealing with.
Yeah, very interesting.
And I think an important point here is there's formal and informal flexibilities matter here. And so we have seen a growth in, I think we've seen it when we know from the research, we've seen a growth in both since the pandemic, but we're seeing some retrenchment in both as well. So formal flexibility, it could be more people working part-time, more compressed hours, greater use of flexi time and different sorts of arrangements. And we obviously in the UK, similar to the US and many other economies, have a real diversity of working patterns, and employers can often, and it's not always two-way flexibility, but we have seen greater kind of rebalancing flexibility, I think, in terms of what employers offer and what candidates want, and the tighter labour markets help that. The informal flexibility, though, around how we help people deal with emergencies, how crises around childcare or around elder care, that's the stuff where I think, in particular, hybrid working has enabled more of that. And I think many workers don't want to settle back into the old ways of being expected to attend and expected to work certain hours. Now, for employers, this presents challenges too around fairness and equity, and also, bluntly around productivity and what we monitor and measure, and how we try and ensure that our workforces are effective. I think many now, so data is really important in this, but it's good to hear more employers talking more broadly about kind of prosperity, organizational health, the health and well-being of their staff, and what they produce. I don't think we're there yet. I don't want to say that everything's fine. It clearly isn't, particularly not in the UK. But I think firms are thinking more about how focusing more on people's well-being, trying to offer more informal flexibility and two-way flexibility as well, in terms of more formal contractual flexibility can help with retention, help with recruitment, but also improve productivity, make organizations more effective. So that may be a positive that comes out of the pandemic, and it's probably been helped by this tighter labour market.
Yeah, I think basically employers, there needs to be a different conversation. I think employers have always, maybe back since the Fordian era, has always been trying to just like maximize productivity from their staff. Like the idea is like any second that you're not adding value to my company is wrong. Like you need to add every single second. But that obviously leads to burnout, and it obviously leads to a lot of people that become annoyed at the company because they can't take care of other things in life. And I think shifting the last 2 years, obviously COVID been a nightmare, but one of the things it has given us is a little bit of a window of what life looks like when you do have some of that feeling of, oh, I can actually do bits of life admin in and around my work, and I don't have to take half a day off to do this stuff. So I think we're very reluctant to give that up, which is definitely something we need to be conscious of. With regards to flexibility and productivity, I mean, I've been like hammered sort of online for saying that, yes, you are less productive sort of away from the office. But that, I think that's the reason why we like it. You know, we don't want to be maxed out all the time. That is exactly, we do less work remotely. Of course we do. That's why we like it. And we should defend it because it's a better way of living than trying to argue on the productivity side. Because I think, okay, if you argue on the productivity side, I think the bosses will win that. They will be able to say, you know what, if I cram you into the office, we're going to crank out more crap. Of course you are going to do that because you're forcing people to absolutely focus and really degrade their life management as the trade-off. Whereas we as workers should say, you know what, I've got 100% of time, employee can have 80% of it, but 20% I need for myself to do this various thing. Anyway, we can argue that at another point. Folks, this might be a natural break, which is something really useful. We always do this at the middle of every show. Brainfood Live is a conversational show. And it needs to be a conversation starting show. And obviously we have to come off air at some point. We're already halfway through. What I don't want Brainfood to ever be is a place where it's a bottleneck and the conversation stops because we can't broadcast anymore. So what I want everyone to do, just take a moment, share your LinkedIn profile into the chat stream on Crowdcast here, or if you're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, wherever you're watching it, just share your link to your LinkedIn profile in a comment thread. And then you simply connect with everyone else who is sharing the same link. Everyone who's watching this show right now is interested in this topic. You know, where are the workers? What do we do about it as recruiters? Why don't you connect with all of these people? And then you've got like a network of folks that you can talk to about these challenges if you so want. There's no reason why this conversation should not continue after we come off air. So take a moment and stick your LinkedIn in the various places I've recommended and then connect everyone there. I would love to connect with you, by the way, but unfortunately I've hit the limit and I can't, so don't be offended. Okay, cool. We've lost Tony, by the way. I don't know why that is.
Tony said in the chat that he had to turn his camera off, but he's back. So maybe you could reconnect him.
I can actually see him on screen. Let me just remove him and then add him again. So Tony, I'm going to kick you out and then you can come back in. How strange.
But in the meantime, there are some other really good comments in the chat. So Lisa, for instance, was saying that, you know, we're talking a lot about skilled workers. We're talking about remote work. That's obviously only available for, you know, at most a third of the workforce, possibly less. But there's a huge part of the workforce that, you know, really needs a wage that pays the bills. You know, I think those types of workers also value flexibility. You know, well-being and care is for others is one of the reasons. But of course, you know, those workers also value non-salary benefits as well. And we have actually just published some research in the US, which shows that when we look at some key non-wage benefits like paid time off, health insurance, that has been rising in job descriptions, probably thanks to a tight labor market. And actually, we've seen the fastest increases in those types of benefits in low-paid jobs. So that's kind of like low-paid jobs catching up to the kind of more skilled, higher-paid jobs in terms of the benefits that employers offer. Now, of course, in Europe, we have a different situation in the sense that, you know, we do tend to rely on public systems for things like health insurance. But there's also a role for employers to play there, I think, in terms of, you know, either topping that up in countries where the public system is failing, like in the UK, or adding other benefits related to flexibility and well-being that people care about.
Are you talking the UK down, Pawel?
Sorry, I mean, it's, I'm just kind of relating this to the point that Tony made earlier, which I think is a really important point about long-term illness being, one of the biggest causes of the growth in inactivity. But actually, before this call, I was looking at a European survey from 2018, which included the UK, where people were asked about whether they're experiencing unmet medical care needs. And back in 2018, which was obviously well before the pandemic and had nothing to do with COVID, the share of the over 16 population in the UK that reported unmet medical care needs was 22 times higher than in Germany or Spain. So that is a long-term problem. And, I think employers, besides lobbying politicians to shore up the health system, should really think about, okay, can we afford to offer something that helps people be healthier, fitter, better for work in that situation.
You know what? The healthcare of the health of the population is such a massive impact on the economic power of the country, isn't it? I mean, imagine if the entire everyone just got fitter by 10%, let's say, fitter and healthy by 10%. The overall economic power of that is going to be enormous. But if you cut the healthcare service, or you kind of relegate it as something that's really low down, or you stop regulating on food quality or whatever it might be, then suddenly you're going to make your population more unhealthy, and then you're going to have this drag factor, people getting sick. People not being productive because they're not in great shape, retiring earlier, whatever it might be. So yeah, it's really short-sighted not to deal with that. I want to deal with Lisa's point on manual versus white-collar labor, because I think that is a critical point. We are in a white-collar bubble. Obviously, we're on a video call. We're kind of doing all this. Many people are not on there, and those are the people that I think. I guess let me just say what I want to say. Is there some sort of attempt by people who are in manual labor to move away from that work and into a world where they can access flexible labor? So let's say I am I'm a waiter at a restaurant. There's no flexi labor there. I've got to be at this restaurant. I've got to serve these customers. I've got to be there all the time. I have no flexibility. I don't want to do that anymore. You know what? I'm going to find a job that's doing something else that's more computer-based, and I can do this. Labor force reallocation. Does anybody have any data on this? And does anybody have any commentary on this idea that there is a shift of what the type of jobs people want to do in order to find the flexibility that can't be done in these other jobs? Anita, you want to say something?
Yeah, so I want to make a suggestion first. I would really like to use the term desk-based versus desk-less, because it takes every connotation out of the conversation, right? So you have people that work at a desk with computers, and you have people who don't. And I think what we have seen in many countries, that people who were desk-less during the pandemic suddenly were called to do jobs that were desk-based. Think of everyone that was needed in vaccination programs, for instance, in call centers, people helping in hospitals. So a lot of people that were desk-less before the pandemic experienced what desk-based work looked like during the pandemic, and those people will not be back. That's as simple as it is. That is one of the reasons why restaurants have such a problem hiring people at the moment. Governments have minimized the employment in those centers, but it is not gone because everyone is thinking what will happen in the fall. But also at the same time, many of these people acquired skills that allow them to go and move on to another desk-based jobs, and those are typically the jobs with higher salaries and more benefits. So it's a logical evolution, I would say, and who would blame them? So that is what I know.
That's a very, very interesting observation, that actually the pandemic economy, if we can call it that, where there were millions of people employed to help manage the pandemic, was actually a massive skills training program. And it diverted a bunch of people who they were taken off from doing the work that they couldn't do. Remember, all the restaurants were shut. Remember, all of the retail was shut. They were repurposed to something else. And guess what? They don't want to do it again. Similar with airlines and flights and stuff. Like, how many people were let go there? They ain't going back. All the warehouse workers or the people that move the luggage around an airport, no, they're not doing that job again. So there was forced labor force reallocation enforced by the pandemic, and that has basically really changed the game for a lot of different sectors. Now, I've read a few reports, again as an amateur, but two different reports, I think one from the European Central Bank and from other places, has made the argument that there hasn't been any significant labor force reallocation. Now, what are your thoughts on this? As I said, every report is going to have a different flavor, but I want to just go round to everybody from your observations. What are you seeing? Can we explain some of the sectoral challenges based on people leaving that industry and going somewhere else? Pawel, let's go to you on this one first.
Sure. So I would kind of tone down the reallocation talk a little bit, just because the workforce is huge, and a lot of the job switching that we've seen, at least in the UK, has really been within sectors rather than necessarily across sectors. And so if you look at the data on workforce jobs by major sector, like manufacturing, construction, healthcare, and you look at the share of jobs by sector and how it's changed over the last 3 years, there have certainly been some changes. So we've seen kind of a slow, steady decline in manufacturing and construction and wholesale and retail trade. We've seen a rise in health and social care, education, administrative services, but those are fairly marginal changes, just because the kind of the composition of the work really changes fairly slowly. So I wouldn't say like the workforce looks radically different today than it did, but there are certainly some trends that the pandemic has accelerated and some other longer term trends related to demographics, the aging population, the decline in manufacturing that we will be seeing.
Very interesting. How about you, Sarah? Let's go to you. Labor force reallocation, is it happening? Yes, no, and to what degree, if so? Oh.
Had some mic issues. Sorry about that. No, I agree with Anita and with Pawel in a different way. I definitely think that in the U.S., for example, right, we have high vacancies in accommodation, food services, travel industry. With respect to what Pawel said, yeah, I think there's some allocation that's happening, but maybe more so within the industry. But I think for me, the point I'll make really quickly is that I think there's a paradigm shift in behavioral choices that's happening. Last week, Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary, he was on the American Enterprise Institute, it's a think tank, and there was a webinar, and people were asking him questions. Do you think that the U.S., I'll speak for the U.S. will ever go back to pre-pandemic? And he said, no. We are in a different world right now. And I get this question asked by clients all over. Do you think that the labor force will come back? Will the labor force participation rate go back up? And I actually have now come to this point and this acceptance, actually, it's almost like philosophical, where I don't think that's going to happen, because not until you address the issues that we talked about today, caregiving, long-term COVID, mental health, all these other like non-financial factors, I feel like you need to address those before things come back to normal, or if a normal is even possible.
The UK government's posture on this is simply to cut the benefits. It's like saying, okay, we're going to force you into work by literally removing your lifeline, therefore work to live. That's the policy right now. Absolutely incredible.
Right. And we've done it in the US too, obviously. Sorry. And still, apparently, we still can't find people. I can
imagine people resisting it and also thinking, you know what, stuff this. I'm going to literally farm things. Our subsistence farming. I think a big before crypto crash, lots of people went into crypto because I felt that they were trying to get an alternative to going back to this constrained workforce. They were saying, you know what, I can actually make money in a different way and literally get out of this sort of rat race, because I'm never going to win that race. Right. We have the quiet quitting phenomenon, which I know people say, look, it's a media manufacturing thing, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there may be something deeper than just that. It could well be it is broadly middle-class people, white-collar working, quiet quitting, basically recognizing that it's a rigged game. And they're never going to get to the promised land by working super hard. So you know what? I'm withdrawing my labor. It's almost like a quiet strike, which I can totally understand sort of why you would do this. Okay. Finally to you, Tony, labor force reallocation. What are your thoughts? Is it happening?
So look, I agree with Pawel's analysis, because the labour market changes very slowly, and some of these changes tend to be quite small, but it's happening at a faster rate. Labour force reallocation and these changes in occupations and sectors is happening at a faster rate now than before the pandemic. And I think what's interesting is the last year or so has shown us how quite small changes in what in the labour market are actually quite small numbers do have these really significant effects in terms of the frictions for people moving between work, in terms of issues for employers, especially when it comes at a time of rising demand and contracting supply. Because supply not contracting everywhere, but certainly in the UK, it's getting tougher. So I'll give you an example. Job-to-job moves. We have about, right now, 1 million people are changing job every 3 months in the UK. That's the highest it's ever been. But before the pandemic, it was about 800,000 changing jobs every 3 months. So it's not actually a massive difference. And this isn't a labour market of 30 odd million people, but it's enough that it is called, that is a really significant driver of what's then causing these issues around how we backfill and combined with lower supply. So I think there's definitely reallocation happening. Some of it is from lower skilled to high skilled as well, for reasons we've talked about. But yeah, it just shows how these small changes actually can have quite big effects.
Is that guy doing some house renovations?
I've actually got to leave. I'm joining you from a conference, from one of our conferences in Brighton. So I'm in a hotel corridor.
Right. Okay.
And I have to go back to our conference now, actually, I'm afraid. So I'm gonna jump out.
No worries, Tony. Wonderful to have you. Thank you so much for jumping in and having this chat. I've been wanting to get you on the show for a while, and you've come in and really delivered everything that we thought. So enjoy the rest of the conference, Tony, and thank you for your contributions. Okay, folks. Let's talk about where we go going forward, because the global economy looks like it will. We've lost Anita as well. That's okay. Sometimes you got to leave. I get it. I got to leave myself in due course. We are seeing, I think, increased risk, obviously, of moving into recession. Higher and higher interest rates in terms of trying to control inflation. That's sucking money out of the economy. If the Federal Reserve continues hiking the rates as it's going to do, then it looks like everyone else is going to have to follow and hike those rates also, which means it's going to be at least a slowdown in growth and maybe a tip into recession. Now, if that is the case, how does that change the relationship between employers and employees? Does it reverse a little bit to the point where actually, a lot of the reasons why employees are resisting coming back to work, are they going to lose a bit of their negotiating power if we're in a state where energy bill, cost of living is going through the roof, the economic opportunities are actually contracting because companies start slowing down growth? Suddenly employers will be able to hire and the cost of employment will go down. Thoughts on this? Let's go around. Pawel, go to you first on it.
Sure. I think that really depends on how governments react to the situation, to be honest, because right now we're seeing a situation where job openings are trending down in many countries, and so if the economy tanks, that decline in vacancies may accelerate, and that may mean fewer job openings, less bargaining power for candidates and for workers. But at the same time, at least for the time being, we're seeing the unemployment rate still staying very low, and the unemployment rate also tends to move quite slowly. So outside the COVID recession, if we look at past recessions in Europe or in the US, it usually takes quite some time for the unemployment rate to rise through lower hiring, in part also through some layoffs. And so it takes time for that pool of labor supply to really build up. So I wouldn't really bet on kind of like a major shift in hiring conditions kind of right away. It will probably take us a while to get there. And at the same time, I think, why does government intervention matter? Well, I think in some countries, like in France and Germany, for instance, there are kind of permanent furlough type schemes that employers can avail themselves of. And I think the COVID period also created a precedent for those governments to ease the conditions of access to those schemes, and for other governments like in the UK or the Netherlands to actually create such schemes when things really, really get bad. So I think that could also kind of put us in a situation where maybe there's less hiring, companies reduce people's hours or put them on furlough, and that doesn't necessarily mean that those employers who are still hiring are seeing a ton of new labor supply.
Yeah, we have to be creative. I'd be interested to know what organizations do. Like, for instance, do you do reduce hours, for instance? Is there any incentive for companies to share labor in a way which we haven't seen before? The new innovations I think will occur. Anita, go to you. Let's say we're heading towards tougher economic times, recession occurs, cost of living crisis, energy crisis. I'm going to take my gas meter reading immediately after this call and submit it straight away. I've already seen what it looks like. It's like ×4. It's going to be horrific. In that scenario, do you see kind of the conversation between employers and employees changing? And do you see that employees will have to basically cave in a little bit more? Workers will have to kind of compromise their current position and re-enter the labor market in the way that they haven't been doing so far?
Yeah, that depends very much on where you live. Because I talked about demographics earlier, and that means that with the number of vacancies as they currently are in a number of geographies, even if there were a recession, the fact is still that more people leave the workforce than enter. And I'll give you an example of the Netherlands. Every year, around 60 or 70,000 employees leave the workforce that will not be replaced by younger people. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of this problem. So for at least for the 2020s, I foresee that at a minimum, Western Europe, but probably also more Mid and Eastern Europe, North America, we will be in a situation where it is really tough to get the people you want.
Do you know what? We're going to have to do another show talking about demographics.
Yeah.
Because I think this is a big topic. We don't talk about it enough, but it may well be that just underlying everything, that may be the issue, right?
So I think it's actually threefold. So it's demographics. It's also skills, right? A lot of the vacancies are for people that are simply not there because we did not educate them. There are way too few people coming out of IT studies here. And for many other geographies, that is exactly the same. So that is, and then the third topic that we didn't discuss at all today, but it is one of my favorite topics, is automation, because I think a lot of this can be solved through automation. And I'm not talking about replacing people. I am talking about alleviating manual repetitive activities from a person's workday, so they actually have 8 hours to spend on value add activities instead of creating reports and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, reports have got to go, folks. Don't you agree? No one needs to write a report ever again.
That was a bad example, but think automation.
I think that's absolutely true. Why? Producing a report is basically a failure of information supply.
Right.
That information should be available to the person who needs a report. There shouldn't be a report. Anyway, thank you very much, Anita. We'll definitely do this show. Right. A final word to you, Sarah. Tell us about a sort of potential recessionary scenario. Does that change the game in any way with regards to candidate shortage?
Yeah, I mean, look, the U.S. on our side, at least, we've seen the Fed increasing rates, and that's obviously designed to impact, right, consumer spending. There's less of that happening. Companies are collecting less revenue. There's more uncertainty. There's a contraction of vacancies. With that, we see higher unemployment. That's like the simple macro flow. And then if you subscribe to the Phillips curve, right, that's basically that inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. I mean, I was looking at projection numbers from UCLA Anderson School of Business, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and they're thinking like around around 4% by the end of 2023. I mean, what is the unemployment rate, right? It's like the number of unemployed over the labor force. I mean, so I feel like companies are going to be in a better position slightly, and I say slightly. And I think people who are actively looking for a job, right, who don't have one, that's the unemployed population, there'll be a bit more competition, but I think people are really cautious. I mean, just based on that recent JOLTS data that I was looking at, where we saw quits go down in the last 3 months, right, but then layoffs slightly going up. And so next Tuesday, the JOLT numbers are coming out for the US. So I'm kind of curious to know what's going to happen. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm seeing right now.
Yeah, and we shouldn't underestimate that all of this kind of chaotic world that we're in increases risk aversion from everybody. Everyone feels like discombobulated with it all. And that's just got to change your confidence a little bit, right? No one feels on safe ground. No one feels, oh yeah, here's the next 12 months. I can totally predict what's going to happen. No, no one knows what's going on. So that's going to stop people potentially from being as bullish, going out there and finding new work. Wow. Anyway, listen, folks, what a great show. A conversation is obviously nowhere near finished. We have to continue it in some way. Hopefully you'll find the time to do it yourselves when you go and connect with everybody who I've recommended you connect with. Obviously, do follow our amazing guests and make sure you connect with them on LinkedIn. Let me take the time to thank everyone for joining us. So Anita Lettink, thank you so much for joining us. Sorry for the little bit of a problem on the mics. It's probably my thing rather than anybody else's, but I appreciate you persevering. And thanks for inspiring a future talk. We'll definitely talk about this a demographic issue. There's a few people already I know that are very passionate about it. And we've got to think like some really deep things, like how do we actually increase the number of people in society? I guess that's having more kids. How do we make them? If people don't want to have kids, do we start doing artificial wombs? Do we start like cloning people? Let's go for it. I don't see why not. We have to. So Anita, thank you so much for joining us. Have a very good weekend. Pawel, great to see you as well. Thank you for joining us. Also wonderful to get your insights. Again, I'd love to try and get some more input from you on this. So if you're happy for it, we'll try and bring you back before the end of the year. Have a good weekend, sir. And Sarah, really good to see you again. Thank you so much for your insight also, Sarah. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And you have a good weekend. Great. Wasn't that amazing, everybody? I thought that was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I'm not sure we've solved any problems, but you know what? We can't solve every problem. I hope we've just been able to elevate the conversation a little bit and get us thinking about some of these bigger issues. Hopefully, some of the things we've talked about today might help you in internal conversations you have with your hiring manager, with your boss, with anybody who's sort of giving you demands, because you can start explaining to them with a bit more confidence, why there is this candidate shortage and why it's difficult for us to find the people that we've been charged to find. Okay, that's about it. Remember, we're going to be back on Monday with Brainfood Break Fresh. That's when we're going to review the Sunday newsletter. If you haven't read the newsletter or you're not subscribed, make sure you do that. It's newsletters.recruitingbrainfood.com. And we'll be back next week. I'll be in Lisbon next Friday. And we're going to be talking about blockchain, Web3, and the future of work. It's going to be amazing. Make sure you sign up for that as well. Okay, everybody, that's about it. Have a good weekend. Thanks for watching.